Welcome, friend. Before we begin tonight's journey through time, take a moment for yourself. Maybe you're settling in after a long day. Maybe the sky outside your window is just starting to darken. Or maybe you're somewhere far across the world where morning hasn't yet arrived. Wherever you are, whenever you are, know that you're part of something gentle and shared. A quiet community of night owls, dreamers, and wanderers, all drawn to the soft pull of the past. Tonight, we're not diving into kings or conquests, at least not at first. We're beginning with something far more ordinary, something essential, something you likely touched today without even thinking about it. A meal. Let's set the scene together. Close your eyes if you like, or simply soften your gaze. Now imagine a wooden table, warped and uneven, set in the corner of a drafty hut. The light is dim, flickering from a single tallow candle or the embers of a cooking hearth. There are no spices in the air, no steam rising from fragrant stews. Instead, the table holds a small wooden bowl of porridge, watery, pale, and bland. Next to it sits a hunk of dense, dark bread, hard at the edges, rough to the touch. If it's a lucky day, perhaps a strip of dried meat, tough, fibrous, and difficult to chew, has been added to the plate. That's dinner, and breakfast, and on many days, lunch as well. Day in, day out. This was the table of a medieval peasant, and for the vast majority of people in medieval Europe, this was the reality. Not a special occasion, but a daily expectation. Meals weren't a time for joy or indulgence. They were about surviving to the next day. Now contrast this with another table, perhaps just a few miles away, or just up the road to the castle on the hill. There, the table is long and lavish. Boars are roasted whole, their skins glistening with glaze. Spices from lands far away, pepper, saffron, cinnamon, float on the air. Fish is served in wine sauce. Dishes are carried in one after another. Eels and pastry, sweetmeats, glazed fruits, honey-soaked tarts. Wine flows freely. Silver glimmers. Music plays. The difference couldn't be more stark. In the same land, under the same sky, 2 meals, 2 worlds. Which brings us to our central question. What happened? What forces, natural, political, economic, conspired to make food so deeply unequal? Why was the medieval peasant's plate so bare, while the nobles groaned with luxury? And what does this divide reveal about life, survival, and power in the Middle Ages? That's the story we'll be gently unraveling together. But before we dig deeper, let's breathe again. Let your thoughts settle. Let the flicker of that hearth light in your mind dim just a little. Because tonight, we're not rushing, we're drifting, backward, softly, toward a time when filling one's belly was a daily struggle. Where every crumb mattered, and where history's grandest dramas often played out not on battlefields, but around the dinner table. Ready? Let's go back. Now let's shift our gaze from the peasant's wooden bowl to something far more distant. Not in the room, not even in the village, but across deserts and mountains, across storm-tossed seas, to where the winds carried the scent of cinnamon trees and the earth gave up ginger roots in silence. You see, in the quiet corners of a peasant's cottage, something was profoundly missing. Not just meat, or sweetness, or fine grain, but scent. The scent of warmth and complexity. There was no cinnamon dusted into hot wine, no sprinkle of black pepper over thick stews. Nutmeg, ginger, cloves. These were more than absent. They were dreams. Distant golden dreams locked away in the pantries of the powerful. These spices, so common in our kitchens today, were once a currency of kings. They came from places peasants would never see on any map they knew. From the dense forests of India, the far islands of Indonesia, the dry highlands of Persia. Their journey to Europe was a perilous epic of its own. Imagine, for a moment, the life of a medieval spice trader. Days on camelback under the burning sun. Nights in unknown inns, clutching sacks of cargo more valuable than silver. Through the narrow passes of the Caucasus, across the sweltering markets of Aleppo and Cairo, all for the hope of reaching the port cities of Europe with his cargo intact. A single ship, heavy with peppercorns and cloves, could mean fortune or ruin, and that fortune was real. In the 11th century, a pound of nutmeg, just 1 pound, was worth 7 fattened oxen. Not coins, not bread, 7 full-grown beasts. To the common folk, it might as well have cost a castle. So, what did the everyday cook have in place of these miracles? Garlic. Lots of garlic. Mustard seeds if they were lucky. A splash of sharp vinegar to wake up tired grains. Some herbs from the garden, parsley, sage, maybe a few wild greens dried by the fire. Sharp, pungent, and functional. That was flavor in the Middle Ages. But flavor, true flavor, that deep, rich warmth that lingers on the tongue and opens the senses, this was reserved, locked behind thick wooden doors, danced across platters at royal feasts, whispered into dishes served on silver. It was not for those who tilled the fields or scrubbed their bowls with sand and straw. And so peasant food remained what it had to be. Not disgusting, but humble, repetitive, predictable. Its blandness wasn't a failure of imagination. It was the echo of inequality, ringing out through kitchens of wattle and daub. In every bowl of watery pottage there was a quiet reminder of what they did not have, what they could not even hope for. And maybe that's the most haunting part. That taste, what we now find at arm's reach in every market, was once a distant echo of power. A reminder that even in the smallest pleasures of life, like a bite of spiced bread, the world was divided. Let's sit with that for a moment. And then, let us continue. Because spices weren't the only thing that made medieval food so different, so lacking. There were deeper problems at play. Problems that shaped every meal, and every hunger that came after. Let's keep walking. If one were to step into the modest hut of a medieval peasant and glance at the contents of their pantry, the most striking realization wouldn't be what was there, but what wasn't. There were no baskets of ripe apples in spring, no juicy tomatoes in winter, no crunchy carrots kept crisp in a cellar. Fresh fruits and vegetables were not daily staples, they were fleeting guests. Without refrigeration or modern preservation methods, produce came and went with the seasons, and most of it never stayed long enough to become familiar. At best, fruits and vegetables were seasonal treats. A handful of wild berries in the summer, a few earthy turnips in the fall, a rare handful of apples if the tree bore fruit and the wind didn't ruin the crop. The lack of predictability made these items precious, not in price, but in presence. Some of the luckier peasants, those who had a tiny patch of land near their home, might grow hardy crops, onions, leeks, or perhaps a small bed of cabbages. These required little maintenance and could withstand harsher climates. But even this modest garden was more an exception than a rule. Most villagers did not own land. They worked it, but did not keep its yield. And even those who managed to grow their own had to stretch small harvests across long seasons of scarcity. What then did they eat every day? Bread, lots of bread, and porridge, and more bread. The backbone of the peasant diet was grain, coarsely milled barley, rye, or wheat when they could afford it. It was boiled into thick stews or baked into heavy loaves. Occasionally, peasants might mix in legumes like peas and broad beans to stretch a meal or add a little variety, but these too were subject to availability and stored without any true guarantee of preservation. Without regular access to fresh greens, this grain-based diet quickly became monotonous. But worse than its repetitiveness was its nutritional shortfall. While filling, it lacked many essential vitamins and minerals. Year after year of this restricted fare often led to visible signs of deficiency: pale skin, weakened immune systems, slow healing wounds. Children grew slowly. Adults suffered from chronic fatigue. It was not uncommon for entire communities to be short in stature, not from genetics, but from the simple truth of malnutrition. This wasn't famine. It wasn't that there was no food. There was just very little good food. Meals were measured in stomachfuls, not satisfaction. People ate what they had, not what they needed. And health, in the long term, paid the price. Perhaps the most poignant detail is this. In times of harvest, food was briefly abundant. There might be feasts, there might be joy, but it never lasted. Winter always came, and with it, the return to bread, broth, and a hope that the next growing season would be kind. In this rhythm of fleeting fullness and long stretches of deprivation lay the quiet struggle of medieval life, not just against enemies or rulers or weather, but against hunger's softer, subtler form, a belly filled but a body still starving. Meat, rich, savory, filling, was the stuff of dreams for most medieval peasants. It was deeply craved, always imagined, but rarely ever tasted. For the vast majority of common folk, meat was not a regular part of life. It was a rarity, a luxury that lay just beyond reach, like warmth in a drafty cottage or gold in an empty purse. To understand why, we must first recognize what animals meant to peasant life. A pig might be raised by a reasonably well-off family, but it was more than just a walking meal. It was an investment. Pigs scavenged for scraps, helped clean waste, and when finally slaughtered, provided enough meat and fat to last a long, cold winter, if preserved right. Chickens provided eggs, not dinner. A cow gave milk, which could be turned into butter or cheese, far more valuable over time than a single meal of beef. These animals weren't viewed as food waiting to happen. They were working assets, living lifelines, and killing them required serious thought. So the knife rarely came out, unless the animal was too old or too sick to be of use anymore. That's why meat was mostly reserved for special occasions. A wedding, a major religious feast day, a birth, a death, moments that broke the cycle of endless toil. During these rare celebrations, a family might slaughter a pig or share in a communal animal. It was never wasteful. Peasants practiced what we now call nose-to-tail eating. Every scrap mattered. Intestines were cleaned and used as sausage casings. Liver, kidneys, tongue, brain, and heart were consumed with care, even if they were tough or bitter. The best cuts were often dried, smoked, or salted to stretch their use. And the bones? Boiled into thin broths for the next several days. But not everyone could wait for a feast. In the quieter, hungrier corners of the village, some peasants turned to small game. Birds, rabbits, even hedgehogs were trapped in the woods or fields. These were humble, barely worth mentioning morsels, but to the underfed, they were cause for silent celebration. However, venturing into the forest for game was no simple act of survival. It was a gamble. Much of the nearby woodland was claimed by nobles or the crown. The royal forests were protected by strict laws, and poaching, even out of desperation, was viewed as theft against the king himself. It wasn't just frowned upon, it was punishable, harshly. Getting caught with a snare, a bow, or even a dead rabbit in the wrong place could mean brutal punishment, the loss of a hand, heavy fines, or imprisonment. In some cases, repeat offenders were hanged as a warning to others. This meant that even the most desperate had to weigh the risk of filling an empty stomach against the price of permanent damage, or death. And so, in many ways, the smell of meat was often just that, a smell. Something that drifted from the Lord's manor on holidays or feast days. Something that stirred memories, maybe stories from a time before. But for the typical peasant, meat remained out of reach, tucked behind layers of value, ritual, and fear. The hunger was constant. The craving never left. But so did the knowledge. A single bite could cost everything. Fish for many medieval villagers offered a glimmer of hope, a way to bring protein to the table when meat was rare, too expensive, or too dangerous to hunt. If one lived near a winding river or the wide open sea, the chances of securing a fish or two were far greater than catching a rabbit in the Lord's forbidden forest. But even this solution came with its limits. Fresh fish, caught early in the morning by those strong enough to rise before the sun, might make its way to a small wooden table by evening. Yet for the majority, especially those farther inland, fish had to be preserved to last beyond the day's catch. There were no refrigerators, no ice boxes, so the methods they relied on were ancient, simple, and reliable in their own way. drying under the sun, slow smoking over smoldering fires, or salting. Heavily salting. Salted fish became a staple in many peasant diets, not out of desire, but out of necessity. Herring was one of the most common catches, hauled in great nets from the cold northern seas. It was cleaned, then packed into wooden barrels with thick layers of salt until it was hard and tough. Cod was also popular, especially dried so stiff it had to be soaked for hours, sometimes days before it could be cooked. Eels, slippery and strange, wriggled through rivers and streams, and though their appearance unsettled some, their meat was nourishing, and they were abundant. Still, the flavor and texture of these preserved fish were a far cry from what we might picture today. There were no delicate, flaky fillets served with lemon and herbs. Instead, preserved fish could be chewy, briny, or pungent. Its presence on the plate brought strength, not pleasure. And for all its effort, it was never quite enough. The fish that the nobility ate, carp raised in stone-lined fish ponds, golden-skinned trout from private lakes, or fattened pike kept just for feast days, was an entirely different story. These were luxury foods, managed carefully by stewards and served only to the few. The villagers might catch a glimpse of them on a noble's table during festivals or celebrations, but they would almost never taste them, so the poor made do. They sliced thin strips from salted herring and mixed them with pottage. They fried eels in the coals if they had a bit of fat. They soaked dried cod and flavored it with onions, herbs, and vinegar, trying to coax some pleasure from its toughness. It wasn't glorious, but it sustained them, and in time, the cooks and women of the household became inventive. Left with little choice, they learned to preserve not only fish, but nearly everything else. Fruits were dried, roots were buried in cellars, cheese was aged and smoked. The art of preservation, born out of necessity, became a daily ritual, a quiet skill passed down, one pot at a time. Their tables were not lavish, their meals were not easy, but through creativity and stubborn resilience, they found a way to make something from the very little they had. And so, with salted fingers and patient hands, they endured. When fresh food was hard to come by, medieval people turned to ingenuity, not luxury. They had no choice but to find ways to stretch what little they had. Without refrigeration or modern packaging, preserving food became both a necessity and a daily art form. The techniques may have been simple, but they were crucial for survival. One of the most common methods was pickling, especially using vinegar or brine. Cucumbers and onions were frequent choices, their crisp textures holding up well in jars. Though these pickled vegetables added sharpness to an otherwise bland plate, they were primarily valued for longevity rather than taste. Fermentation was another key strategy. It turned perishable foods into longer-lasting versions that could survive through winter. Cabbage, for instance, was fermented into sauerkraut, not just in German regions, but widely across Europe. It added a tangy, sour note to meals and offered small amounts of much-needed vitamin C. Even dairy products were transformed. Milk became cheese or sour curds, which could be stored for weeks or months, depending on the technique. Then there was drying, a method as old as the hills. Apples and pears were sliced thin and laid out under the sun or near the hearth. Dried fruit had a chewy sweetness and was a prized addition to dull winter stews. In some homes, strings of drying herbs or fruit were a common sight, hanging from rafters like garlands of practicality. These preserved items added some much-needed variety to the peasant diet, which otherwise revolved around grains and coarse bread. A pickled onion could brighten up a chunk of barley loaf. A spoonful of sour cabbage brought color and acidity to a gray porridge. Dried apples might even pass for dessert on feast days. But still, let's not romanticize too much. These foods, as creative as they were a far cry from the vibrant flavors of fresh produce. Pickled vegetables were often sharp or overpowering. Fermented foods could become unpleasant if storage conditions failed. Dried fruits were tough and sparse. The ingenuity was impressive, but the results were rarely delicious. And yet these methods sustained life. They allowed families to survive from harvest to harvest, from summer into the bitter heart of February. Women, in particular, took took on the responsibility of preservation. Their skill in putting up food was as crucial as sowing or harvesting. Cellars and larders, filled with jars, crocks, and dried goods, became quiet symbols of hope. Still, there was no guarantee. Sometimes pickles went soft, cheese molded too early, the weather refused to cooperate, and dried fruit rotted on the string. Preservation was a gamble, not a promise. And as we move forward in our story, it becomes clear that even the most familiar and beloved foods of the Middle Ages had their problems. Even staples like bread and ale were not always trustworthy. Not everything in the medieval pantry was honest. The bread may have looked hearty, and the ale smelled rich and golden, but many a hungry villager bit into a crust only to find grit, or sipped a tankard only to be met with watered disappointment. Unscrupulous bakers had many tricks up their flour-dusted sleeves. To stretch their meager supplies and maximize profit, some would mix ground acorns, powdered chalk, or even sawdust into the dough. The result? Loaves that were as hard as rocks and about as nutritious. A child might gnaw on a slice for minutes before giving up, tossing the lump aside like a pebble. The deception wasn't just about taste, it was about survival. A loaf meant to sustain a family might do little more than fill bellies with bulk. Ale, too, wasn't safe from this era's quiet fraud. Watered down until it barely held the memory of barley, it was still sold at full-strength prices. Alewives, women who brewed and sold ale from their homes, were central to village life, but not all were saints of the suds. There was Elizabeth. In a cramped cottage, steam rising from her iron cauldron, she stirred the thin brew while her 2 children sat huddled by the hearth. She remembered the ale her grandmother had once made, thick, creamy, and bold with hops. A family recipe passed down with care. But that richness was now impossible. The cost of grain had risen again, and if she didn't stretch the batch, she wouldn't sell enough to buy more barley. She sighed and reached for the bucket, tipping more water into the pot. Her shoulders slumped. "Forgive me, Nana," she whispered. Yet despite its dilution, ale, weak though it was, remained one of the safest beverages available. In a time where water could carry deadly bacteria from animal waste or human runoff, even a lightly fermented brew offered protection. The boiling during brewing killed off many of the nastier elements, making ale a lifeline. Children drank it. Laborers drank it. It might not lift the spirits, but it kept the sickness at bay. Still, the authorities tried to keep order in the world of daily bread and drink. In the 13th century, the assize of bread and ale attempted to bring fairness to the market. It set standards for weights, prices, and ingredients. A baker caught cheating could be fined, or worse, strapped into the pillory in the village square, mocked as townsfolk pelted them with spoiled turnips. But laws on parchment did little when hunger was loud and enforcement was sparse. Inspectors were few, corruption was common, and the desperation of poverty often overwhelmed any fear of consequence. After all, what was a fine to a man who had no coins? What was a law to a mother trying to feed 6 mouths with 3 loaves? For peasants, life was a constant compromise. Every bite of bread and every gulp of ale carried a question. What's really in this? Is this safe? Will this fill me or make me sick? In the end, it wasn't just food that was adulterated. Trust itself had a bitter aftertaste, and even the staples, the bread and ale they depended on, couldn't always be trusted. If there was one element of medieval food life that turned the stomach more than the bland porridge or the moldy bread, it was the setting in which that food was eaten. Perhaps the most unappetizing aspect of medieval dining wasn't the food itself, but the utter lack of hygiene that surrounded it. Long before the discovery of germs, before anyone understood what made food spoil or bodies fall ill, contamination lurked in every corner, silent, invisible, and constant. Imagine a small thatched cottage. Smoke from a low-burning fire clings to the ceiling beams, stinging the eyes. A family gathers around the hearth, sharing a pot of thin stew. On the dirt floor, a pig snorts and roots through the rushes, its grunts a regular part of the dinner soundtrack. Chickens peck nearby. Perhaps a goat nudges at a bucket in the corner. Everyone, animals and humans alike, shares this cramped, low-ceilinged space. Warmth is precious in the cold months, and the body heat from livestock is as valuable as wood for the fire. But this closeness came at a price. The same animals that provided milk, eggs, or meat also left behind their waste. There were no toilets, no drains, no running water. Straw or reeds were spread on the ground to soak up the filth, but these were rarely changed. Over time, they turned dark and sour, mixing with the mud and droppings. It was on this floor that children crawled, food was dropped, and bare feet padded. And into this environment came the fleas, the lice, the flies. They thrived in the damp, in the rot, in the unwashed bedding, and the sweat of unbathed bodies. Open wounds festered, sores lingered, illness spread quickly and often mysteriously because no one yet knew about bacteria or viruses. They only knew that someone coughed or a child grew pale, and then the fever came. Even the food preparation offered little protection. There were no sinks with soap. Hands were wiped on aprons that had already seen days of labor. The same wooden boards used to chop raw meat might be used to slice bread or serve the next meal. Water came from rivers and streams that might double as latrines upstream. Milk turned sour in the heat. Meat went bad and was eaten anyway. Spoiled wasn't always a reason not to eat. It was often a question of whether the stomach could handle it. And it wasn't only the poor who lived with filth. Even in the grandest castles, sanitation was a challenge. Chamber pots were emptied from upper windows, spilling into courtyards. Waste ran down trenches that sometimes passed frighteningly close to the kitchens. Rats were everywhere. Servants slept near sculleries. Banquet halls sparkled with tapestries and silverware. But behind the scenes, the filth lurked just the same. The lack of separation between life, labor, livestock, and meals made every bite a gamble. A child might eat a piece of bread with dirty fingers, having just played near the pig pen. A mother might stir stew in a pot crusted with the residue of yesterday's soup, using a spoon carved years ago and never once fully cleaned. And yet, this was daily life, not out of neglect, but because there was no other way. This was how generations lived and ate and endured. The food may have been bland, but more often than not, the greater danger wasn't what was missing, but what might already be crawling in. The narrow streets of medieval cities were not just crowded, they were suffocating. Noise, filth, and disease clung to every stone. People jostled shoulder to shoulder, carts of goods and livestock blocked alleyways, and overhead, waste sometimes rained down from windows above. The problem wasn't just the population, it was what that population produced. Human waste, animal waste, food scraps, rot. All of it was dumped into the streets or open cesspits. It was common to see piles of dung slowly liquefying underfoot. The gutters overflowed, even in dry weather, with filth blackened by rot and crawling with insects. And in the heart of it all, running through cities like London, was the River Thames, a vital artery of trade and water, and a tragic illustration of medieval misunderstanding. The Thames was where people drew their drinking water, and it was also where they dumped the contents of chamber pots, slaughterhouse offal, and rotting market waste. The result was predictable: poisoned water. Sickness became inevitable. It's no wonder that foodborne illnesses were rampant, one chronicler wrote bitterly. Even royalty was not immune. Indeed, no level of social class could completely shield someone from the consequences of medieval hygiene. One of the more cautionary tales comes from the life and death of King John of England, the same King John who signed the Magna Carta in 1215. Late in his life, John reportedly overindulged at a feast, gorging on peaches and washing them down with new cider. To modern ears, that might sound quaint or even delicious. But at the time, both items were risky. Peaches, especially those not properly cleaned or left too long in a warm kitchen, could host bacteria. New cider, unfermented or partially fermented, was a gamble, harboring pathogens that stronger alcohol might have killed. John fell violently ill. Dysentery gripped him, a painful, exhausting, and deadly condition in those days. Within days, the king who once held dominion over lands from Normandy to Ireland was dead, and his royal blood offered him no protection. The specter of disease hovered constantly over medieval life, and in the 14th century, that specter took on its most terrifying form, the Black Death. Cities like Florence, Paris, and London became graveyards. As rats scurried through trash-filled alleys and fleas jumped from animals to humans, the plague burned its way across Europe. Entire families died within days. Streets were emptied. Whole villages were abandoned. Historians estimate that the Black Death wiped out a third of Europe's population. But the groundwork for this devastation had been laid long before, through filthy conditions and a lack of sanitation that allowed vermin to thrive. Even places meant to nourish people, like the open-air food markets, were harbingers of death. Meat stalls buzzed with flies, their wings wet with blood. Rodents nibbled at unguarded grain. Bread grew moldy by midday. Buyers and sellers mingled, oblivious to the invisible threats around them. Still, people ate. They had no choice. Hunger was a constant, and the knowledge of microbes, bacteria, or food poisoning simply did not exist. A man might say a prayer before a meal, not realizing it was more than just tradition. It might be his last supper. Looking back, it's almost miraculous that anyone survived the perils of medieval dining at all. Yet they did. Through faith, luck, and sheer human resilience, they endured. But the legacy of their suffering reminds us how far we've come and how much we once risked every time we sat down to eat. But not every corner of the medieval world was ruled by famine, scraps, and desperation. In scattered patches across the countryside, there stood tall, sturdy walls made of stone and prayer, the monasteries and abbeys. These places, often built far from the noise of towns and villages, were havens of relative plenty. Inside those cloisters, time moved differently. Gardens were well tended, orchards bore fruit, and the monks, cloaked in brown robes, tilled the earth with steady hands and quiet devotion. The air smelled of herbs, ripened pears, and sometimes of bread baking in stone ovens. You see, the monastic orders didn't just pray. They farmed, they brewed, and they cooked. In fact, some monks were renowned for their culinary skill, carefully fermenting cheese, curing meats, and even experimenting with spices when they could afford them. A few, the truly gifted or well-funded, went so far as to pen early cookbooks, quiet records of stews and soups, of what plants worked well in which season, of how to bring joy through humble meals. But here's the quieter truth. This abundance was not shared freely. The gates of monasteries did not swing open to every hungry traveler. Much of the food was reserved for the brethren, their fasts, their feasts, their rhythms of worship and work. Yet, not all was held back. Many monasteries, especially in larger towns, did offer alms, gifts of food or coin to the poor. It wasn't constant. It wasn't always enough. But to the desperate man who waited in the cold morning fog, hoping for a scrap of bread or warm broth, that one act of charity could mean the difference between collapse and survival. Some churches even held poor feasts on holy days, simple meals for the neediest in the parish, not feasts in the noble sense, but feasts of dignity, offered with humility. In these moments, the world felt, just briefly, less cruel. And in that exchange, between the giver and the beggar, there was something tender, a flicker of shared humanity. Not everyone turned their eyes away from suffering. Still, charity alone could not fill all the stomachs of the hungry. And not everyone lived near a monastery. Even those who did could not depend on its goodwill to survive the harsh winters or the lean harvests. But, for some, at least, it was a flicker of hope, a candle in the dark. And while the common folk clung to scraps and prayers, a very different kind of meal was being prepared in the great halls of the powerful. For the nobility, Food wasn't just about survival. It was spectacle. It was statement. Feasts, grand and glittering, would soon take center stage. The flickering torchlight danced across gilded walls, casting warm shadows over long wooden tables, groaning beneath the weight of extravagant dishes. In the great halls of medieval nobility, feasts were more than meals. They were political statements, displays of affluence, and sometimes outright competitions of indulgence. Picture a royal banquet, dozens of dishes meticulously prepared and lavishly presented. Roasted swan, adorned with its own re-feathered skin, peacock with vibrant tail splayed like a fan, delicate pasties filled with minced meats and spices, and sweetmeats layered in honey and almond. The richness of the table was rivaled only by the variety, each plate a proclamation of power and prestige. Servants darted between guests, their arms heavy with platters. The clinking of goblets filled with dark red wine and the golden hue of ale echoed through the hall. Spices, saffron, cinnamon, cloves were generously sprinkled over meats and vegetables, their heady aroma wafting through the air. Imported at great expense, these spices were as much a sign of wealth as they were flavor enhancers, and they were used in abundance, not merely for taste, but also in the hope of masking the spoilage of ingredients that had been stored without any real refrigeration. The atmosphere was one of gluttonous revelry, with laughter rising above the music of lutes and flutes. Guests feasted until belts were loosened and heads grew heavy. Yet behind the spectacle of wealth and celebration lurked dangers that not even the highest born could avoid. But even these lavish spreads were not without their dangers. The kitchens of great halls, often chaotic and poorly ventilated, were far from the sanitary sanctuaries one might imagine. With so many dishes prepared at once, and food left out for hours before serving, the threat of contamination loomed large. Food poisoning was a common occurrence. Spoiled meats and rancid sauces took their toll, sending noble stomachs into violent revolt. The very spices used to disguise decay could not shield the privileged from the consequences of poor preservation and questionable freshness. The sheer volume of food consumed in a single sitting posed its own risks. Nobles prided themselves on their ability to indulge, often pushing themselves past the point of satiety. This led to painful digestive issues, bloating, vomiting, and at times, even death. Physicians of the time, lacking modern understanding of digestion, might recommend bizarre remedies that only worsened the condition. Even the most sumptuous meal could end in a night of agony. What was meant to impress could turn into a regrettable gamble. And yet, the feasts continued, partly out of tradition, partly due to the pressure to maintain appearances, and partly because medieval life offered few comforts. In a world of political intrigue, harsh winters, and limited medical knowledge, an extravagant meal was a fleeting escape, one that many were willing to risk. This was the paradox of noble dining in the Middle Ages, a world of silver platters and roasted game birds, where the threat of sickness sat silently beside every guest. Even the privileged were not immune to the hazards of medieval dining. Behind the velvet drapes and beneath the gold-leafed ceilings, their bodies were just as vulnerable, their guts just as fragile. The table, though rich in presentation, was just another stage upon which the great equalizer, poor food safety, played out its inevitable role. After walking through the bleak kitchens, sour cellars, and banquet halls of medieval Europe, it's hard not to pause and breathe. The harsh realities of food in the Middle Ages, the daily hunger, the scarcity of fresh ingredients, the ever-present threat of illness from a single meal, all of it casts a long shadow. And yet, from that shadow rises something unexpected: gratitude. Today, we live in a world where food is more than just survival. Our supermarkets brim with fresh produce from around the globe: oranges from Spain, bananas from Ecuador, berries in the middle of winter. Our meats are safe, inspected, packaged, and chilled. Our spice racks? Overflowing. Paprika, cinnamon, turmeric, cumin, the kinds of luxuries that once arrived by camel, ship, or caravan, hoarded in royal kitchens, now sit in glass jars on humble shelves. The sheer variety available to us daily would be incomprehensible to someone from the 14th century. But with that abundance comes a strange kind of forgetfulness. We forget, sometimes, just how good we have it. That we don't have to fear moldy bread or rancid fat. That we rarely go to bed unsure of where our next meal will come from. That even a disappointing dinner is, more often than not, a full one. And so we marvel at our ancestors, not with pity, but with respect. They endured, they adapted, they took what little they had, stale grains, coarse salt, cloudy ale, and made it last. They baked when they could, stewed what they caught, and shared when it mattered most. With no refrigeration, no sterile kitchens, and few spices to mask bad flavor, they relied on creativity, resilience, and community. It wasn't enough to eat. They had to learn how to make something edible from what many of us would throw away without a second thought. Tonight, perhaps, before your next meal, whether it's a lavish feast or just a sandwich, take a moment. Look at the plate before you. Think of the hands that grew, harvested, packaged, and delivered every ingredient. Think of how many generations it took to bring us from famine to fulfillment, how many unknown hungry souls had to scrape by so that one day food could be more than just fuel. Raise a glass, if you like, not just to your own fortune, but to the quiet, persevering spirit of those who came before, to the peasant who threshed grain by hand, to the mother who stirred thin soup for her children, to the monk who planted herbs in stony soil, to the butcher who knew which cuts were safe, to the cook who learned how to make do and how to make delicious. And if tomorrow you find yourself frowning at a meal that isn't quite hot enough or bemoaning a restaurant's under-seasoned dish, take a breath. Remember the medieval diner. Picture him, weary, bent with labor, smiling faintly at a steaming bowl of porridge. It might be bland, it might be plain, but to him, it is everything. A moment of peace, a rare comfort, a small, hard-won blessing. When we reflect upon the long and winding road of human sustenance, it's comforting to know that we are the fortunate inheritors of centuries of culinary progress. From the coarse loaves of barley bread baked over open flames to the complex flavors layered into today's cuisine, every bite we enjoy stands atop generations of hardship, trial, and quiet triumph. The lessons are many. We see perseverance in the face of famine, creativity sparked by scarcity, and the enduring power of the human spirit to find sustenance and joy even in the darkest of times. Our ancestors didn't have the luxury of abundance, yet they found ways, some clever, some desperate, to survive. And in their struggle, they laid the groundwork for the flavors and freedoms we so often take for granted. Let us not forget the value of these lessons. The history of food is not only about what was eaten, but how people endured. Through war, disease, harsh winters, and social collapse. Their legacy isn't just in the recipes passed down, but in the resilience embedded within those recipes. A stew made from scraps, a soup thickened with stone-ground roots. These dishes tell stories of survival, of mothers feeding their children with whatever they could find, of communities gathering to share what little they had. So as we set our tables today, may your own culinary journey be filled with flavor, nourishment, and the warm glow of gratitude for all that we have been given. Whether it's a simple sandwich or a lavish dinner, there's quiet power in recognizing that each meal is part of something much larger than ourselves. And with that, we take a final glance back before diving into a darker corner of culinary history. In Part 4, Adulterated Food and Drink, we'll explore how desperation sometimes gave way to deceit, and how not every loaf of bread or jug of ale was quite what it seemed. Picture this: a dusty street at dawn. A baker, sleeves rolled up and eyes darting nervously, glances left and right before slipping back into his cramped shop. The smell of yeast and damp wood fills the air. He moves quickly, pulling out a small sack from beneath the counter. Sawdust. With practiced hands, he begins to knead it into the dough, muttering to himself about stretching his paltry supply of flour. It wasn't malice, it was survival. and it was far from rare. Let's step further in. For many bakers, this deception was the only way to eke out a meager living. Faced with rising grain prices, poor harvests, and an ever-hungry population, the temptation to stretch supplies was too strong to resist. Honesty in such times rarely paid the rent or fed a family. And so, little by little, the sacred trust between baker and buyer began to fray. Bread was the lifeblood of the medieval diet, but its purity was often compromised. What should have been a nourishing staple became a vehicle for survival tactics, some born from desperation, others from greed. Fillers like ground acorns, chalk, or even sawdust were kneaded into the dough, producing loaves that were coarse, gritty, and sometimes painful to chew. They filled the belly, yes, but offered little in terms of real nourishment. What once symbolized sustenance had, for many, become yet another burden. The irony was cruel. The very staple that sustained peasants through the hardest of winters had transformed into something they now had to endure. Bread, once a humble comfort, now scraped at the gums, sat like stone in the stomach, and whispered of betrayal with each bitter bite. Mothers broke it into soups to mask its dryness. Children picked at it reluctantly, their small bodies already thin from lack. The bakery's warmth no longer promised satisfaction, only disappointment. And the deception did not end at the baker's door. Ale and wine too fell victim to the desperation of the times. These drinks, once safer than water and sources of modest pleasure, were often watered down or tampered with. The alewife stirred her vat, not with pride, but with anxiety. What had once been a craft passed from mother to daughter had become a matter of sheer survival. Elizabeth stood in her cramped brewing room, stirring in yet another bucket of cloudy water. Her fingers, red from the cold, trembled slightly as she worked. Her children hovered near, their hungry eyes watching each drip. They knew that their next meal, perhaps their only one that day, depended on this batch. She dared not look at them for too long. The guilt clung too thick. She paused for a moment, letting the wooden spoon rest against the side of the vat. Her eyes glazed over, remembering the rich, full-bodied ale her grandmother once crafted. A family recipe passed through generations, once brewed with honey and herbs, a touch of warmth in a cruel world. Now it was a memory diluted, like everything else. She sighed deeply. Necessity had drowned the old ways. In these small deceits, whether in a bakery or a brewhouse, lay the daily truths of medieval life. Not villains, but victims of circumstance, these men and women made impossible choices. And those who consumed their goods often had no other choice. To refuse the loaf or the drink was to go hungry. The chain of hardship stretched from field to table, from hand to mouth, and at every link, someone bent the truth just enough to survive another day. In a world where clean water was more a blessing than a certainty, adulterated ale and wine became an unfortunate necessity. The clear, running streams romanticized in poetry were, in truth, often teeming with unseen danger. Wells, the lifeline of many a village, were frequently contaminated by human and animal waste. Rivers doubled as sewers, washing away filth from tanneries, privies, and butchers' scraps, only to return it downstream, right where someone else might dip their pail for supper. Faced with this grim reality, peasants turned to what little they could trust. The alcohol in their drinks, though often watered down and stripped of flavor, retained enough potency to kill some harmful bacteria. It wasn't about getting drunk, it was about survival. For many, that cloudy mug of ale, no matter how weak or bitter, was safer than the well out back, a practical shield against dysentery and worse. But even this solution came with a price. Forced to choose between the sickness of tainted water or the empty calories of watered-down ale, peasants found themselves in a constant cycle of compromise. There was no good choice, only the least harmful one. A mother might give her child a mug of thin ale not because she wanted to, but because the alternative might mean fever by morning. And while the deception in drinks was widely known, efforts were made to curb it. The assize of bread and ale, first introduced in the 13th century, imposed strict regulations on the purity of these essential goods. It promised hefty fines, the shame of the pillory, even jail time for those caught cheating their customers. In theory, it was the crown's way of protecting its subjects. But laws, however noble, often fell flat when weighed against the hunger of the poor. Enforcement was sporadic at best. Local officials, themselves struggling, might turn a blind eye to a neighbor's tampering. A sympathetic glance, a few coins exchanged, or simply the burden of too many cases to inspect meant the law rarely reached where it mattered most. In the alleys, in the thatched villages on the edge of the manor's eye, the rules bent and buckled under the weight of need. It was the same tired dance, survival over legality. A tavern keeper might pour a bucket of water into his cask and silently curse the loss of taste. A brewer might skip an ingredient, knowing full well her regulars would notice, but also that they'd keep coming back because they had no other choice. Each mug, each crust of bread, was a reminder of a precarious existence. The constant compromise between nutrition and trickery, between honesty and necessity, was etched into daily life. And with every meal came the bitter taste of resignation, not from seasoning, but from centuries of systemic struggle. As the evening shadows stretched across stone walls and thatched roofs, the meager meals were served in homes that were themselves part of the problem. Cramped, smoke-filled, and often infested, these living spaces were no sanctuary from the daily struggle for food. In the next chapter, we explore how the very spaces in which they lived, their huts, hovels, and halls, contributed yet more challenges to their pursuit of a decent, nourishing meal. Picture, if you will, a small thatched cottage huddled against the chill of a medieval winter. The wind howls outside, rattling the wooden shutters. Inside, the air is thick with smoke from a low-burning peat fire. There's no chimney, just a small hole in the roof that barely carries the smoke away. The family gathers around the hearth, not for comfort, but for survival. Their breath mingles with the steam rising from a bubbling pot of thin pottage. In the dim corner of the room, a pig roots through the rushes spread across the dirt floor. It snorts and grunts softly, the sound constant and strangely familiar. A few chickens roost in the rafters above. A goat lies curled against the back wall, chewing slowly. There is no separation, no privacy, no line between human space and animal quarters. This was the daily reality for countless medieval peasants, a life lived not just alongside livestock, but with them, inside the same four walls. The reasons were as practical as they were desperate. Animals provided not only food and milk, but warmth. A pig's body heat could keep a single-room home from freezing overnight, and keeping animals indoors protected them from thieves or wolves, real threats in the rural countryside. But this convenience came at a cost. The animals did what animals do: relieved themselves, shed fur, scratched at the walls. Their dung and urine soaked into the straw covering the floor, mixing with the debris of human life: crumbs, ash, spilled broth, old bones. The rushes might be changed every few weeks, if that. More often, new ones were simply laid on top. The result? A thick, fermenting mat beneath the feet, damp, alive with insects and rank with odor. Fleas, lice, and other vermin thrived in the warm, filthy conditions. Rats scurried in the shadows, gnawing on anything edible. Illness passed from livestock to humans and back again, silently and without remedy. Disease was a constant, lurking presence. Respiratory infections from smoke-filled air, skin infections from lice, diarrhea from contaminated food prepared just feet from where animals slept. There was little understanding of hygiene, no concept of germs or bacterial contamination. Sickness was seen as fate or divine punishment, not as something preventable. Even in castles, where nobility lived in relative luxury, the issue of sanitation was never far removed. The great stone walls might keep out raiders, but they didn't stop the stink. Waste from the upper floors drained into cesspits below. Chamber pots were emptied out of windows into courtyards or moats. In summer, the stench was unbearable. In winter, the filth simply froze in place. But the peasant cottage, small and crowded, was the true battleground. There was no servant to sweep out refuse, no staff to manage waste. The mother stirred the pot while the toddler toddled through manure-streaked straw. The father patched the roof while flies buzzed around a dying hen in the corner. It was survival stripped down to its rawest form, without comfort, without space, without safety. And yet, it was life. It was normal. Generations lived and died in these homes, their bodies adapting as best they could to the filth, the cold, the diseases that picked off the young and the old alike. As we leave the stifling cottage behind, we turn our gaze to another factor compounding these hardships: the poor state of medieval medical knowledge. In the next section, we'll explore how beliefs about health, sickness, and the body shaped not only how people ate, but how they tried to stay alive, often with results more harmful than helpful. Even the highest walls and richest plates could not shield medieval people from the silent killers that stalked their daily lives. Disease did not discriminate, and without a proper understanding of hygiene, even the most lavish feasts could end not in satisfaction, but in tragedy. Consider the case of King John of England, the very monarch who signed the Magna Carta. In 1216, he fell violently ill after consuming what chroniclers called a surfeit of peaches. It wasn't gluttony that killed him, but likely the peaches themselves, spoiled, contaminated, or poorly handled. Modern historians believe his death was caused by dysentery, a brutal illness brought on by consuming tainted food or water. Despite his wealth, his title, his access to the best food and care the kingdom could offer, he still died from a dinner gone wrong. If the king could fall, what hope was there for the poor? In the crowded cities, the situation was even more dire than in rural hamlets. Urban centers like London were hotbeds of filth and infection. Streets were narrow, poorly drained, and perpetually slick with mud, animal droppings, and worse. Chamber pots were emptied straight into the street. Pigs roamed freely. Butchers slaughtered animals on open pavements, blood and entrails running into the gutters. The stench was constant. The risk was ever present. Nowhere was this more visible than the River Thames. It served as the city's lifeblood, its primary source of drinking water, fish, and commerce. But it was also its toilet. Raw sewage, rotting meat, the runoff from tanneries and dye makers. All of it poured into the same river that quenched London's thirst. The water shimmered with oils and waste. In hot summers, it festered. In colder months, it merely thickened. Within this bubbling, open sewer, disease flourished. Dysentery, typhoid, and a host of other illnesses stalked the crowded alleyways and dim tenements. But no illness captured the terror of the time like the Black Death. Carried by fleas hitching rides on the backs of rats, the plague swept through Europe in the 14th century with terrifying speed. The rats themselves thrived in the uncollected garbage, the warm crevices of overstuffed homes, and the heaps of waste lining every street. One bite, one breath, one touch, that's all it took. Entire neighborhoods were silenced. Cities emptied overnight. Bells tolled endlessly. Corpses piled in carts, too many for the graveyards to hold. In some cities, the death rate was so high that families nailed shut their own doors and waited in silence for death to come. And yet in all this, the peasant had no escape. He lived and died amid the filth, his immune system battered by hunger, his gut eroded by tainted grain and spoiled ale, his breath choked with the smoke of a dung-fueled fire. There were no real doctors, no antibiotics, no hand-washing, no germ theory. The idea that invisible agents might pass from rat to flea to man was unknown, unthinkable. A simple bowl of stew, a fresh-looking piece of fruit, a sip of cloudy ale, each could carry death inside it. Eating was no longer just a matter of hunger or taste. It was a gamble with every bite. And so, as we leave the crowded city behind, the clang of church bells fading into the smoke-filled air, we turn now to the beliefs that shaped how people tried to survive. Not through science, but through tradition, superstition, and ancient theories of the body. In the next section, we'll dive into medieval medicine and the strange ideas that governed what people thought was healthy and what could kill you. After everything we've seen, the spoiled food, the filthy streets, the gnawing hunger, the constant fear of illness, it would be easy to fall into despair. And indeed, for many medieval peasants, despair was a familiar feeling. Their lives were hard beyond modern comprehension, and the daily struggle for survival left little time or energy for comfort. But amidst the darkness, there were still glimmers of light. In small villages and tight-knit communities, survival was rarely a solitary affair. Neighbors knew one another by name, by voice, by the rhythm of their footsteps. A child's cough might prompt the quiet arrival of a neighbor with a pinch of dried herbs. A dying sow might mean one family goes hungry, unless another offers a handful of grain or half a wheel of cheese. Food, even when scarce, was shared more often than hoarded. For most peasants, generosity wasn't charity, it was survival, because they knew, next week, it might be them with nothing. And in these fragile bonds, a kind of strength emerged. Community gatherings, often built around the rhythm of the seasons and the church calendar, offered brief but vital escapes from the daily grind. A wedding feast, even if humble, meant laughter, dancing, and a momentary fullness of belly. Feast days sponsored by the local lord or the church brought boiled grain, root vegetables, and sometimes even meat to tables where such luxuries were rare. In these moments, hunger was quieted, not just by food, but by the warmth of shared humanity. Even more deeply embedded in daily life was faith. The church, for all its power and flaws, was a constant. Its spires towered over towns and villages alike. The tolling of its bells marked the passage of time, not just for worship, but for work and rest. Morning prayers, midday mass, evening vespers, these rituals gave structure to chaos. For many, faith was not just belief, it was comfort, it was explanation, it was hope. When crops failed, it was God's will. When a child died, it was a test. When bread rose and fire warmed, and a mother survived childbirth, it was grace. Inside the stone walls of the church, peasants found not just sermons and scripture, but sanctuary. Monks and nuns sometimes provided soup and bread to the poor. Parish priests might counsel those in despair. And though the grandeur of cathedrals was often inaccessible to peasants, even a small village chapel offered the smell of incense, the hush of candlelight, the sense, however fleeting, that something greater watched over them. But the church was not only a source of comfort, it was also a powerful authority. Its teachings shaped every aspect of daily life, especially food. What you could eat, when you could eat, and how much you could enjoy. These were spiritual matters. The rules of fasting, of abstaining from meat, of avoiding gluttony. These weren't just religious suggestions. They were laws of the soul. To eat too well was sinful. To eat on forbidden days was a mark of weakness or rebellion. Still, even within these constraints, faith offered the poor something the world rarely did: dignity. If their suffering was part of a divine plan, then it had meaning. If hunger was a test, then perseverance was holy. And so we move now from the glow of village fires and church candles into the institution that defined the medieval moral order, the church itself. In our next chapter, we'll explore how this vast spiritual machine not only dictated when and what people ate, but how it used food to control hearts, minds, and bodies alike. The bells are tolling again, not just for prayer, but for power. If hunger was already a constant companion in the life of a medieval peasant, the church made sure it wasn't just physical, it was spiritual too. For those already clinging to survival by the thinnest thread, religious mandates around food offered no relief. Instead, they often added weight to an already unbearable burden. The Catholic Church, ever present and deeply entrenched in medieval life, dictated not only how one prayed or repented, but how one ate. Frequent fasts were expected. Entire days each week were designated as meatless, and none so infamous or so grueling as the season of Lent. For 40 days, longer when including Sundays, Peasants were expected to abstain from meat, dairy, and eggs. That meant no butter for their pottage, no cheese for their bread, no bit of salted pork to flavor a stew. For the nobility, such abstention was softened by access to fish, spices, and luxurious alternatives. But for the poor, it was something else entirely. It was deprivation piled upon deprivation. In a small village near the edge of a crumbling forest lived John and his wife Margaret. Together, they toiled from sunup to sundown, hands calloused from digging in hard soil that yielded too little. Their 3 children, Thomas, Alice, and baby Matthew, grew up hungry, their ribs visible beneath thin tunics, patched too many times to count. When Lent came, it wasn't just a time of spiritual reflection. It was a season of dread. John had managed to trap a rabbit just before the fast began, and Margaret had quietly churned a bit of butter in secret. But now both spoils sat unused. To eat them during Lent would be to defy the church, and in an age when the soul mattered more than the body, that wasn't a risk many were willing to take. They faced a painful choice: break the fast and feed their children well, or keep to the rules and trust that God would see their faith and reward them in the next life. They chose to obey. Meals became ever more sparse. Their daily fare, already meager, was reduced to coarse bread, a few spoonfuls of watery pottage, and on rare occasions, a dried herring or two traded from a distant coastal town. The children cried at night. Margaret chewed each bite slowly, not out of savoring, but to make it last longer. John, once strong enough to carry logs on his back, began to stoop, his energy drained with every passing day. By Easter, their faces were gaunt, their skin pale and drawn. Even the baby Matthew, who once laughed at the fire's flicker, was now too weak to cry. And yet, they endured, because to them, this suffering wasn't meaningless. It was penance. It was purification. It was, in some strange and sorrowful way, a gift to God. Margaret would murmur prayers over the pottage, hands folded tightly, whispering, "This is our offering." And John, in the silence of the evening, would watch the smoke drift from their chimney, lifting toward heaven, and hope, faintly, that someone was watching. That someone saw. The church taught them that such sacrifice was holy, that their hunger was not in vain, that a reward waited beyond the suffering, if not in this life, then in the next. But for the peasant class, Lent wasn't just a spiritual trial. It was another reminder of the hierarchy that ruled every part of their existence. Those who had the least were asked to give the most, and they did. Because even when the body starved, faith still found a way to feed the soul. The church was not entirely deaf to the plight of the poor. Though its laws and doctrines often added weight to an already heavy burden, there were moments, brief and vital, when it extended a helping hand. Across the medieval countryside, monasteries and abbeys stood like islands of stone in a sea of toil and want. For the desperately hungry, they offered something that was increasingly rare: bread, alms, and sometimes a kind word. These religious houses, built upon lands granted by kings and nobles, controlled vast estates and productive farmland. Their barns were stocked better than most village granaries, their granaries more full than the pantries of lords. It was from these stores that charity flowed. On designated days, the poor lined up outside monastery gates, children with hollow cheeks, women in threadbare shawls, old men leaning on splintered sticks. A monk or lay brother, often silent and stern, would hand out small loaves of coarse bread or thin broth, enough to get a family through another day. These acts of mercy were not purely altruistic. They were also deeply rooted in theology. Feeding the hungry was a holy act, a way for monks to serve God through service to the lowest of his flock. And in many cases, it did offer real relief. For some peasants, it was the difference between starvation and survival. But even this kindness had its limits. When the harvests failed, when rains drowned the wheat or the sun scorched the barley, charity was quickly overwhelmed. The lines at the gates grew longer, the bowls emptier, and the monks themselves were forced to ration their stores. Hunger spread like a shadow across the land, and the church's aid, however well-intentioned, could not keep pace with the despair. Desperate times led to desperate acts. And here, the church's mercy ran dry. One evening, in a village hemmed by forest and ruled by silence, a man named Simon crept through the underbrush with a snare and a quiet prayer. His children hadn't eaten in 2 days, and the monastery had turned him away with only a crust of bread. He knew the risks. These were royal forests, protected by law. But the thought of another night listening to his children's empty bellies was too much. He caught a hare, one small hare, enough for a stew. He never made it home. The foresters found him before he reached the edge of the trees. He was dragged before the local steward, tried without ceremony, and sentenced. The punishment for poaching, even for the hungry, was brutal. A hand removed, a branding iron, or in harsher cases, death. Simon's fate was sealed, and the church, which had once fed him, stood silent. This was the cruel paradox of faith in medieval life. For all its sermons on compassion, for all its moments of charity, the church remained firmly part of a system that punished the poor for doing what they had to do to survive. The laws it helped enforce protected landowners, not laborers. Its mercy had boundaries, and its silence in the face of injustice was often deafening. Monasteries gave bread, yes, but they also owned the land that peasants could not hunt. Priests preached sacrifice, but dined on fish and wine. Faith sustained many in their darkest hours, yet it also demanded obedience in the face of cruelty. For peasant families like Simon's, faith was a double-edged sword. It was hope. It was structure. It was something to cling to in a world that so often seemed indifferent. But it was also a trial in itself, another force to be endured, another master to serve. And now picture a different world. A world not of straw floors and shared breath with livestock, but of soaring stone walls and glittering candlelight. A shocking contrast. While peasants huddled over meager bowls of pottage, barely surviving the long nights of hunger, the noble households of medieval Europe played host to spectacles of culinary excess. Let us step inside such a scene, not to admire, but to understand the chasm that divided one life from another. In the great hall of a castle, the air is heavy with the warm glow of 100 flickering candles. Shadows dance across thick tapestries that adorn the cold stone walls, embroidered tales of conquest, divine right, and family pride. Beneath a vaulted ceiling, the scent of roasting meat and exotic spices drifts like perfume, teasing every breath with decadence. At the far end of the hall, beneath a canopy embroidered in gold thread, the lord and lady preside like monarchs over their domain. Their garments shimmer with rich fabrics, silks dyed in deep crimsons and forest greens, their hands adorned with rings bearing gems that catch the candlelight. Before them stretches a massive oak table, groaning under the weight of countless dishes. Servants move like clockwork, replacing platters as soon as they empty, pouring wine into goblets carved from crystal and gold. Here, food is not merely sustenance, it is theater. Whole roasted pigs lie on silver trays, their skin glistening and crisp, their mouths stuffed with fragrant apples. Next to them, a platter of delicately spiced peacock, its feathers reassembled for decoration, dares the guests to indulge in its exotic elegance. Trays of manchet bread, fine white loaves reserved for the highest class, spill from linen-lined baskets, their warm crusts perfumed with sweet butter. Aroma fills the hall, the deep, earthy tang of saffron, the bite of cinnamon, the sweetness of cloves. These spices, shipped from lands thousands of miles away, are more valuable than gold. Their presence here is not just for taste, it is a declaration of power, a reminder that the world itself is bent to the will of the nobility. At the center of this orchestra stands the master cook. He is more than a servant. He is an artist. With precision and pride, he orchestrates every element of the meal. From meats basted for hours to pies filled with quail and dates, every dish is a masterpiece, designed not only to nourish, but to impress. And then come the subtleties. These are no mere desserts. Sugar, rare and precious, is sculpted into elaborate confections, castles with battlements, unicorns with delicate spiraling horns, scenes of hunts and battles frozen in crystal sweetness. These sugar sculptures are passed from guest to guest, admired and nibbled, symbols of a world so far removed from hunger that it plays with food. Yet beyond the castle gates, just a short ride away, a family lies in the cold, sharing a crust of rye bread and praying the church gives them broth come morning. That is the true contrast. The feast is magnificent, but its magnificence casts a shadow that stretches across the fields, into the hovels, through the stomachs of children who haven't seen meat in a year. To witness this table is to understand inequality, not as an idea, but as a reality. The Lord raises his goblet in celebration, his hall echoing with laughter and lute music. Meanwhile, in the same kingdom, under the same sky, someone digs through dung for roots. This was the medieval world. Brilliant, grotesque, unequal to its very bones. Dishes appear in an endless parade, each more extravagant than the last. Diners, cheeks flushed and bellies rounded, gorge themselves with the gusto of those who know no hunger. Spoons dip into creamy almond soup, rich with spices and thickened with rice. Fingers tear at succulent roast venison, juices dripping onto embroidered sleeves. Laughter erupts as someone spills a goblet of ruby-colored wine across the table, barely noticed in the din. There is blancmange too, an opulent dish of milk, shredded chicken and sugar, its delicate flavor savored by the Lord's guests as if it were ambrosia itself. Bowls of stewed fruit glisten with honey and rosewater. The heady scent of cloves and cardamom hangs thick in the air. And they drink. Goblets of richly spiced wine pass from hand to hand. Tankards of frothy ale are drained and refilled without question. The feast is not merely about food. It is about indulgence, about displaying one's distance from the common world of toil and want. But even here, amidst the revelry and opulence, reminders of the body's frailty creep in. A noble woman, flushed with wine and rich sauces, suddenly pales. Her hand trembles as she rises unsteadily from the table. She excuses herself with a tight smile, her stomach rebelling against the overload. A hush falls for a moment, broken by a laugh and another toast. Across the hall, a knight chews slowly, wincing. His teeth, already blackened from years of sugared delicacies, throb with pain. A piece of overcooked mutton forces a grimace from him, but he says nothing. Weakness is not welcome here. And behind them all, in the shadows, the serving staff watch. They move silently and efficiently, trained, disciplined. They refill goblets, clear empty platters, mop up spills. But their eyes linger. They see every overstuffed mouth, every half-eaten pheasant discarded, every sweet wasted by guests too full to finish. They watch the gluttony not with admiration, but with a quiet, seething mixture of envy and resentment. They know the truth, that once this feast is over, once the great hall grows cold and quiet again, they'll return to their own meals, coarse barley bread, maybe a ladle of thin gruel. The scent of roasted meat will still cling to their clothes, a cruel reminder of what passed their hands but never their lips. Tomorrow they'll wake before dawn, their stomachs rumbling, to serve again. The memory of this evening, a celebration for the privileged, will hang in the air like smoke. This is the other side of the feast. Not everyone drinks from silver goblets. Not everyone eats blancmange. For every lord raising a toast, there is a servant bowing low. For every dish sculpted in sugar, there is a child somewhere gnawing on hard crusts. And even here, in the castles of the wealthy, there is no immunity from discomfort, from illness, from the quiet, constant breakdown of the human body. The stark contrast is undeniable. Food in the medieval world was not just nourishment. It was hierarchy, it was spectacle, it was power. For the rich, it meant abundance, pleasure, and control. For the rest, it meant labor, longing, and a life of watching others eat their fill. As we near the end of this journey through the kitchens and fields of medieval life, it's worth pausing to look at our own tables and to feel a deep, quiet gratitude. Today, many of us enjoy a level of abundance and variety that would have been utterly unimaginable to a medieval peasant. From the humblest corner store to the largest supermarket, food is not just sustenance, it's convenience, luxury, and art. Imagine, just for a moment, taking a man like John, our exhausted peasant father, and placing him in a modern grocery store. He would not recognize it as real. The lights would dazzle him. The hum of refrigeration units, the bright packaging, the towering shelves. The produce section alone, stacked high with oranges, pineapples, strawberries in winter, would seem like something out of a dream. He'd stop in disbelief at bananas, fruits that grow in lands he's never even heard of. The sheer variety would be overwhelming. So many cheeses, so many cuts of meat, boxes of cereal, frozen meals, shelves full of spices he'd never smelled, sauces he couldn't name. To him, it would be like stepping into a fairy tale, a land of unimaginable plenty. And yet, even in this land of plenty, we face challenges our ancestors could never have foreseen. We now grapple with the environmental toll of this abundance. Deforestation, soil degradation, plastic waste, emissions from transporting food across oceans. Even in a world so full, not everyone has equal access. Food deserts still exist. Millions still go hungry. And then there are the health consequences. The strange irony that abundance can lead to malnutrition of a different kind. Overprocessed, sugar-laden, nutrient-poor diets that leave us both full and starving at once. In our pursuit of plenty, have we sometimes lost sight of balance? Medieval peasants, for all their hardship, understood the rhythms of the earth. They ate what was local, what was in season, what could be gathered or grown without chemical intervention. Their meals may have been humble, but they were often more sustainable than ours. There is wisdom in that simplicity. Perhaps we can learn to appreciate the changing seasons again, not just on the calendar, but in the foods on our plates. Strawberries in summer, apples in fall, hearty stews when the nights grow long. There's value in the handmade, the home-cooked, the thoughtfully prepared, not because it's quaint, but because it reminds us of care. And in the midst of our fast-paced world, maybe the truest luxury is time. Time spent cooking, sharing, and savoring a meal with those we love. Our ancestors, despite their suffering, knew that joy could still be found around the hearth. A warm bowl of pottage, a crust of bread torn and shared, the comfort of eating together after a long day's labor. Their lives can still teach us something. To waste less, to share more, to see food not only as fuel, but as connection to each other, to the land, and to the long line of people who came before us. So next time you shop for groceries or sit down to a meal, take a moment. Notice the colors, the smells, the flavors. And remember, this is extraordinary. We are surrounded by the bounty our ancestors prayed for. Let us meet it not with guilt or overindulgence, but with wonder, with responsibility, and above all, with gratitude. And so, as our long, winding journey through the kitchens, fields, and feasting halls of the Middle Ages comes to an end, let us take a moment, not just to look back, but to honor those who walked this path before us. Raise a glass, or perhaps a humble wooden cup, to the countless generations who toiled, who endured, who hoped. They lived through famines, fasts, harsh winters, and unforgiving laws. They raised children on crusts of bread and bowls of pottage, drew strength from faith and family, and against all odds survived. Through their resilience, they laid the foundation for the world we now inhabit. Their meals were rarely feasts. A serf's dinner might be little more than coarse bread and a ladle of thin stew, made from cabbage, onions, and maybe a few lentils. On good days, a strip of salted pork or a sliver of dried fish added a hint of richness. It was a diet as monotonous as it was meager. Meanwhile, in the great kitchens of castles, the royal cook bustled about in a whirlwind of preparation. Peacocks roasted and redressed in their own feathers, pies filled with spiced meats and sweet fruits, sculpted sugar castles, and golden goblets of wine. But for most of the realm's subjects, such wonders existed only in rumor or in dreams. And yet, even privilege was no shield against the risks of medieval eating. Food spoiled quickly. A noble might dine on gilded plates, but there was no refrigeration, no knowledge of bacteria. A wrongly preserved dish could mean illness or death. King John of England, history tells us, died of dysentery after a feast, the final blow delivered by a surfeit of peaches and spoiled wine. In the Middle Ages, food was always a gamble, no matter your rank. Still, people endured. They adapted. They planted seeds not only in the soil, but in time, cultivating knowledge, techniques, and traditions that slowly reshaped the world. And now, here we are. We live in an era they could never have imagined. We are surrounded by abundance, by choice, by refrigeration, pasteurization, and preservation. We can have strawberries in winter, mangoes in spring, meals from across the globe ordered with the touch of a screen. But with that abundance comes responsibility. The memory of the past, of the hunger, the inequality, the fragile lives once lived around fire and pot, should not make us smug. It should make us grateful. It should make us wise. We still live in a world where many go hungry, where food is wasted, where the earth groans under the weight of our excess. So let us learn from those who came before us. Let us remember the dignity of a simple, well-cooked meal, the joy of sharing, the necessity of fairness, and the power of food, not only to nourish bodies, but to shape lives and societies. If we honor that legacy, if we carry it forward with care, perhaps we can build a future where all may eat with joy, with dignity, and with plenty. Here's to the past. Here's to those who endured. And here's to the table we set tomorrow. May it be full, not just of food, but of compassion, of justice, and of hope. In the end, even the throne could not offer protection. King John of England, one of the most powerful men of his age, died not by sword or betrayal, but by food. A surfeit of peaches and spoiled drink, consumed during a lavish feast, brought on dysentery, and it killed him. It was a stark reminder that in the medieval world, food was never just nourishment. It was risk. It was gamble. It could be your salvation or your end. But if kings fell to bad food, what hope was there for the poor? For the vast majority of people, the risks were greater still. Their meals were neither plentiful nor secure. There were no choices, only whatever could be found, begged, or foraged. When harvests failed and the grain bins ran low, desperation crept in. The temptation to eat spoiled or contaminated food was often too great to resist. Bread with a sour smell, stew with meat turned gray, butter crawling with unseen rot. A full belly, even temporarily, seemed worth the risk. In the leanest years, people turned to whatever they could find. Acorns ground into bitter flour, grasses boiled into bitter green mush, weeds, roots, bark, even animals that had already died of disease. These weren't acts of carelessness, they were acts of desperation. And even when food appeared wholesome, danger lingered. Bread was a staple, but bakers, squeezed by rising grain prices, sometimes stretched dough with ground chalk or sawdust. These impurities could sicken the hungry and the weak. Ale was safer than water, but brewers too diluted their barrels, stretching every drop. Then there was the alewife. She was a familiar figure in every village, apron tied tight, sleeves rolled high, ladling out frothy ale from great barrels. Sometimes she was trusted. Other times, feared. In a world steeped in superstition, a bad batch of ale could turn deadly. A man fell ill after drinking at her tavern. Was it poor grain or poison? The line was blurred, resentment festered, and so in many towns, it was the alewife who bore the weight of suspicion when stomachs turned and fevers rose. But the real culprit was rarely a person. It was the system, the scarcity, the lack of knowledge, no understanding of bacteria, no refrigeration, no safety nets. Every mouthful came with risk. In noble houses, servants whispered when a dish smelled off. In peasant homes, children ate with hope in their eyes and rumbling in their bellies, unaware that the meal could bring fever or worse. And still, people ate. Because they had to. Because the body demands it. Because hunger screams louder than caution. This was the medieval reality, not the fairy tale banquet, but the daily grinding uncertainty of what the next meal might bring. The precariousness of life meant that even a simple meal could become a matter of survival. And often, it meant choosing between hunger and hazard. Today, we live in a world transformed by science, sanitation, and preservation. But to understand the past is to appreciate the quiet heroism of simply getting through the day. To eat, to feed one's family, to endure. These were acts of courage. And for many, they still are. Even in the bleakest corners of medieval life, there were moments, fleeting, fragile, of comfort. The world was harsh, yes. Food uncertain. Bellies often half full. But in the glow of a hearth, with family huddled close, a simple meal could become something more. A crust of coarse bread dipped into steaming pottage, a thin stew of barley, onions, perhaps a shred of salt pork on good days, could feel like warmth not just for the body, but for the soul. Laughter from a child, a shared sip of ale. The quiet companionship of those who had endured the same cold mornings and long, hungry evenings. These were the small joys that sustained the common folk. Not opulence, but togetherness. Not abundance, but resilience. In the quiet stone walls of monasteries and convents, life was different, but not necessarily easier. Monks and nuns lived by the rule, a life of discipline, of prayer, of purpose. Their diets were intentionally austere, a spiritual discipline as much as a physical one. No meat, except for the sick. Meals taken in silence. A diet heavy in beans, root vegetables, bread, and ale. For many, this simplicity was a blessing. Less distraction, fewer temptations, a focus on the divine. But even in the monastery, food remained central. It was fuel for prayer, but also a challenge of obedience, and nothing tested the body and soul more than Lent. For 40 days leading up to Easter, the rules tightened. Gone were even the modest comforts of the regular monastic table. Gone the cheese, the eggs, the rich black ale. What remained was simple: bread, water, maybe a little salted fish, a few bitter greens from the garden. It was a time of reflection, repentance, and for many of real physical struggle. Some monks welcomed the hardship. They saw the hunger pangs as a form of spiritual cleansing, a way to bring the body in line with the soul, a kind of holy clarity through discomfort. But others struggled. Whispers of temptation stirred in the cloisters, the smell of food cooking in the village beyond the walls, the memory of richer meals. Even in holy places, humans were still human. And outside the monastery, among the laboring peasants, the concept of voluntarily giving up food often felt baffling, even absurd. To starve on purpose? One might mutter, shaking his head. When food was already scarce, the idea of self-imposed deprivation seemed like madness. Yet the church's grip was strong, and so, even among the poor, Lenten fasts were observed, in spirit if not always in strict practice. It was a time of meagerness layered upon meagerness, but also of shared sacrifice, of a kind of solidarity, even if unevenly borne. There were no grand feasts here, no gilded platters, but there was a kind of grace, in a mother offering the last heel of bread to her child, in a monk lighting a single candle in the refectory, in a peasant family kneeling before their lone bowl of stew, giving thanks for what little they had. Hardship shaped every corner of medieval life, but so too did meaning, and sometimes even hunger had purpose. For all the scarcity and uncertainty that marked medieval life, one truth remained constant. People found ways to survive. And not just survive. They adapted, persevered, and made do with what little they had. It was not a world of comfort. It was a world of necessity, But even within that, there was ingenuity. They learned to stretch what was available. They salted meat when they could afford it, smoked fish in the cool air of riverbank villages, dried herbs and fruits in the fleeting warmth of summer, stored grains in sealed clay pots, hoping they'd last through winter's bite. Every technique was hard-earned, passed down, refined over generations. They knew that waste was not an option, that even a tough root or a stale crust had value. Soups and stews were stretched with onions, leeks, or wild greens, bones boiled for every last drop of flavor, crumbs saved for puddings. Even ale dregs found new life in bread or brewing. It wasn't luxury, it was survival with dignity. And within that frugality, they still found joy. A fire on a cold night, a warm bowl of pottage after a long day's work, the crisp tang of an apple picked fresh before the frost. They took comfort in small pleasures, in gathering with family, in marking holidays with a bit of honey or dried plum, in trading eggs for herbs or sharing cheese with a neighbor. Because the story of medieval food isn't just about hunger, it's about resilience, ingenuity, adaptation. These were not people waiting to be rescued. They worked the land, shaped their fates, and endured. And in their endurance, they left a legacy. Today, we live in a world of staggering variety, supermarkets brimming with produce from across the globe, fridges that hum softly through the night, meals that appear with the tap of a screen. But that abundance came at a cost, and through a journey paved by centuries of labor. We owe thanks to those who came before, to the farmers who turned rocky fields into fertile ground, to the cooks who learned to coax flavor from scraps, to the gatherers, the butchers, the bakers, who carved survival out of the earth and fire. And even now, in our time of plenty, their spirit endures. We still face uncertainty, climate change, inequality, food waste. We still seek security, balance, and nourishment. So perhaps in looking back we can find perspective, to recognize the miracle of a full pantry, to savor a meal not just for taste, but for the history that made it possible, to waste less, to value more, to remember the long winding road from hearthstone to microwave, from field to shelf. The story of medieval food is a story of human strength, and in their story, we find echoes of our own. So tonight, as we sit down to eat, whether it's a simple snack or a full feast, let's raise a quiet thanks to the perseverance of those who came before, to the resilience that carried us here, and to the continued work of building a world where all may eat with dignity, comfort, and joy. Imagine just for a moment a medieval peasant, clothed in rough homespun wool, boots caked with mud, stepping through some tear in time and landing squarely in the fluorescent glow of a modern supermarket. The doors slide open automatically. The lights are bright, artificial. A cool humming breeze from the air conditioning brushes against his face. He blinks, stunned. Before him stretch aisles upon aisles, row after row of packages, bottles, tins, and boxes. Color everywhere. Logos, labels, brands, signs shouting discounts and deals. At first, he is overwhelmed, awestruck by the sheer abundance. He wanders into the produce section. Grapes, bananas, mangoes, tomatoes in every shade. Fruits he's never seen, vegetables out of season. He sees pineapples, a fruit once so rare and costly that kings commissioned paintings of them, stacked casually in a bin near the entrance. He stands before the meat counter, marveling at the gleam of salmon, the deep red of beef, the endless stacks of packaged chicken, sliced ham, frozen fish fingers. It is too much. And still, he walks. The cereal aisle nearly defeats him. So many boxes, bright colors, cartoon animals grinning back at him. He stares at a freezer door, wipes his sleeve across the glass, and peers in. Frozen pizzas, microwave dinners, ice cream in flavors he cannot begin to imagine. He finds something shiny, a bag of Cheetos. He reads, confused, made with real cheese. He chuckles, then frowns. Real cheese. In this? And yet it feels like air in his hand. The idea of cheese, once reserved for the Lord's table, now puffed and powdered in a bag meant for children. He shakes his head in disbelief. A snack like this, he thinks, would have fed his entire family for a week. But wonder gives way to unease. What is all this? What are these ingredients? Names he cannot pronounce. Numbers and chemicals. Shelf-stable for years. How can food come from across the world and still look so fresh? Why does none of it smell like a farm, or a kitchen, or the earth? In his time, food came from the soil, the field, the river, the hand. It was simple, sometimes bland, often insufficient, but it was known. It was real. Here, he senses something hidden, a distance between people and what they eat. He doesn't understand refrigeration or preservatives, but he feels the strangeness of it all. He sees children pulling bright candy from shelves, distracted parents scrolling their phones, carts piled high with plenty, but few faces showing delight. It's a land of excess, but not always joy. And maybe, quietly, he starts to long for something simpler. A crust of bread, a bowl of steaming pottage, a meal that took hours to prepare, but fed both belly and heart. He turns to leave. He has seen the future, and it is wondrous, but also bewildering. Perhaps, he thinks, there is something to be learned here. Perhaps those who live in this future might one day remember the value of enough, the richness of simplicity, the meaning of sharing, the dignity of food made with care. And perhaps we, looking through his eyes, can remember too, that our modern food system, with all its abundance and convenience, also brings its own burdens, environmental tolls, health concerns, loss of connection. But if we're mindful, if we choose wisely, if we listen to the wisdom of those who lived with less, we can nourish not just our bodies, but our souls. As the sun set in streaks of gold and rose over the bustling port city of Venice, a weary figure stepped off a creaking wooden ship and onto the stone quay. His name was Luca, and he was a spice merchant, one of the few men who dared to walk the razor's edge between fortune and ruin. Slung over his shoulder was a tightly bound satchel, small and nondescript, yet worth more than its weight in gold. Within it nestled his precious cargo, delicate strands of saffron, tiny black pearls of pepper, the woody coils of cinnamon bark, and the heady perfume of cloves, sealed in waxed pouches. Each of these treasures had made a perilous journey across oceans and deserts, through mountains and markets, and now, at last, had returned with him to the heart of Europe. Luca had spent months on the Silk Road, enduring more than most men would in a lifetime. He'd ridden alongside camel caravans across the scorched plains of Persia, haggled under the shadowed canopies of eastern bazaars, and once narrowly escaped a bandit ambush near a mountain pass in Anatolia. A sandstorm in the Karakum desert had nearly buried his caravan. Dysentery had claimed 2 of his porters. But this was the price of spice, and the nobles of Europe paid handsomely. In Venice's opulent halls, pepper was more valuable than gold. Nobles would offer fortunes for just a pinch of saffron to flavor their fish or dye their silk. These exotic seasonings were status symbols as much as they were culinary delights. Yet for all the shimmering grandeur of the spice trade, Luca could not ignore a darker truth, one that weighed on him now as he made his way through the cobbled back streets of the city. He passed a baker's stall where children lingered, noses pressed to the warm-smelling wood. There was no pepper in their bread, no cinnamon in their porridge. For them, and for millions of peasants across Europe, spices remained a distant dream, their meals dull and lifeless. The gulf was staggering. While noblemen dined on roasted pheasants glazed in honey and cloves, washed down with wine warmed by nutmeg, the common folk gnawed at crusts of coarse brown bread and bowls of thin cabbage soup. And all the while, merchants like Luca risked everything to bring these riches to shore, only for them to vanish behind the closed doors of palaces and manor houses. He remembered the treacherous mountain paths, the aching thirst, the constant fear that at any moment his life and his cargo might be lost. And what was it all for? He had coin, yes, A modest villa just outside the city, with servants to tend his needs and fine woolens to keep him warm. But even as he approached the iron gate of his home that evening, passing lamp-lit canals and the smell of salt in the air, Luca couldn't shake the bitterness. He had earned his comfort, fought for it, bled for it. But it came with the knowledge that his work only deepened the rift between those who had and those who hungered. The world, it seemed, ran on spice and suffering. Still, morning would come, and with it, the tides. Luca looked out toward the harbor, where ships rocked gently in their moorings, sails furled like sleeping wings. Tomorrow he would once again set sail for distant lands, chasing the winds, the trade, and perhaps, in some distant future, a world where flavor and fortune weren't reserved for the few. As the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, Matilda stirred from her slumber, her body already aching before she'd even risen from the straw-stuffed mattress. The bitter chill of the late autumn air clung to the stone walls of her cottage, seeping through the rough blanket wrapped around her shoulders. There was no time for lingering. The sun had barely touched the earth, but the day's labor had already begun. Autumn in the countryside was a season of ceaseless toil, filled not with the beauty of turning leaves, but with gnawing anxiety. The scent of drying herbs and damp earth hung in the air, mingled with the unspoken worry that this year, the stores might not be enough. The specter of winter loomed ever closer, and with it came the unrelenting fear of starvation. For Matilda, every scrap of food mattered. Nothing could be wasted. Not a bruised apple, not a single withered root, not even the bony remnants of a chicken stew. The idea of throwing food away was laughable, dangerous even. Each morsel preserved could mean the difference between enduring the frost or succumbing to it. She remembered once when she was a girl, overhearing tales of noble banquets, tables groaning with roasts, honeyed pies, and silver goblets of spiced wine. Now, as a grown woman, bent over a pot of boiling brine, Matilda could only think of such stories as cruel jokes, fables told by the well-fed to those too busy working to dream. With calloused hands and a back twisted by years of labor, she pickled turnips and onions in earthen jars. She salted the few pieces of pork they'd managed to obtain after the last pig slaughter, watching the white crystals soak greedily into the meat. A small rack of herbs hung near the fire, drying slowly. Sage, thyme, nettles. Even bitter roots and wild greens were treated as treasure. The work was monotonous, repetitive, and utterly exhausting, yet Matilda could not afford to rest. Time was short, and the cold would wait for no one. Even as her hands grew raw from chopping, stirring, and lifting heavy pots, she pressed on. At times her mind wandered to what January might bring: snow-covered fields, frost-bitten fingers, and bowls filled with little more than coarse bread and watered-down gruel. If the harvest had been meager, if the rats found the grain stores, if the roof leaked again, she dared not dwell on it. Hunger was a constant presence, whispering at her shoulder even as she worked to fend it off. And yet, in a quiet way, her labor was more than survival. It was defiance, a refusal to let the cold and the hunger claim her family without a fight. With every salted strip of meat and every jar sealed tight, she declared that they would endure. Then, one gray morning, the first snowflakes began to fall, dusting the thatched roof and whitening the fields beyond the garden. The wind howled softly through the trees, and Matilda paused at the doorway, arms folded across her chest. She looked toward the storage room, the hanging meat, the jars stacked carefully, the sacks of dried peas, the bundles of dried herbs. It was not abundance, but it was something. It was hope. She closed her eyes and whispered a prayer, not for warmth or even for full bellies, but for enough. Because for her and for countless others like her, winter was not a season to be endured with idle hands or romantic notions. It was a war, fought silently, day by day, with no weapons but sweat, grit, and the fragile resolve to wake each morning and carry on. And now, the real fight was about to begin. And so, there was a time when hunger wasn't just a feeling. It was a way of life, a shadow that knocked on every door, hidden in every mother's whispered prayer. But in those same dark days, people learned to survive with resilience, simplicity, and quiet ingenuity. Now, as you lie comfortably in bed, perhaps thinking of tomorrow's breakfast, take a moment to remember the hands that earned their bread through sun, snow, and centuries of struggle. If you enjoyed tonight's story, please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Here on Boring History for Bedtime, we open a new door each night into the lives of those who came before us. Lives that were never truly boring, only quietly forgotten. And in the comments, tell us, where in the world are you listening from tonight? We'd love to know.